Thank you, everyone, for coming back for our evening presentation. So tonight we have the Clever Hands presentation. So this is a talk that's at every International Society for Equitation Science conference that is given by a non-equitation science. And so we're lucky enough to have Rick Hester talk to us today. And so some of us were fortunate enough to be given a tour around Cheyenne Mountain Zoo by Rick yesterday that was utterly fabulous. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Rick Hester. He is the curator of behavioral husbandry for the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo in Colorado. He oversees all the zoo's behavior programming. His work includes the zoo's animal training for husbandry, medical and public show behaviors, environmental enrichment, developing programs to improve problem behavior situations, the zoo's formal animal welfare assessments, and exhibit design for behavior goals. He's worked at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo since 2006. He spent 10 years working as an animal keeper, caring for a wide variety of species, including small primates, great apes, penguins, African lions, and bears. In 2015, he started working with Dr. Susan Friedman and began to understand the importance of behavior analysis and its application for animals in human care. He has curated the zoo's behavior program since 2018, is affiliate faculty at Colorado State University in the Department of Biology, and he's a consultant and course co-instructor for Susan Friedman's Behavior Works, LLC. And tonight, he's going to be talking to us about engineering environments with reasons to behave. Thank you.
Well, I'm taller than who was ever here last. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for coming back. The idea of sending an entire conference of people out to the bar after 9 hours of presentations and asking you to come back seemed a dangerous proposition. So I'm grateful that I'm not standing here by myself. So thanks for coming back, and thanks so much for having me. I was thrilled when the Sarahs reached out and asked if I would be part of this conference. I got a little confused at first because different Sarahs would email me, and then I realized there were three involved, and I was thrilled to join and be part of this. And it's been a really fantastic day of exciting presentations. And just right from the beginning, with Kate's wonderful introduction, it really resonated with me, and what you all in this room are talking about doing with horses is really parallel to what we've been talking about doing with animals in zoos. And I thought it was interesting that when Kate laid out the timeline that you've been doing this work, it matches up almost exactly with the timeline that we've been doing this work in the zoo community. So we're really converging on some of the same ideas, and I always think that's a very exciting phenomena. So I'm thrilled to join you, and I'm excited to talk about some of what we're up to in the zoo world. And for the most part, there won't be any horses here, but I think that the concepts and the philosophies will be relevant and interesting. So to kick us off, this is a beautiful quote from Hal Markowitz. Much of the beauty of the animal resides in its behavior. And behavior is what I'm here to talk about tonight. So that's our subject matter, if you're around me anyways. We're going to talk about behavior. Hal is considered the father of modern-day environmental enrichment. He was a behavior analyst that worked in zoos in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we are still very much chasing his vision 40 years later. He was so far ahead of the curve when it came to the idea of how to provide meaningful behavioral opportunities to animals in human care. So, of all the possible measures of well-being of an animal or a person, behavior is by far the most immediately available to us. We can observe it directly, and it's happening all the time. And it gives us so much information about the quality of the experience of that individual learner. So from my level of analysis, behavior is the thing. We're not using it to make inferences about anything else. It's the thing we care about. Behavior is what we're measuring, and behavior is what we're working to change and support. And I'll give you some examples tonight of ways that we're working to do that. So just to kick us off here, this seems like a nice place to start anytime I'm talking about our work in the zoo, is sort of identifying these major levels of analysis that are interested in behavior. And they all come at it from a different philosophy. They come at it from different points of view, and they're interested in different correlates of behavior. And what I thought was really exciting today is that we've heard from every one of these levels of analysis today regarding the care of horses. And as I was listening to you all today, it reminded me of a quote from an interview with Robert Epstein. Epstein is a major contributor in behavior analysis. He was B.F. Skinner's last grad student, and they were interviewing him about their work, and he said, this was decades ago, he said that in order to understand behavior, we would have to come to have a grand synthesis, that we would need to know what the brain is doing, and we would need to know what the genes are doing, and we would need to know what the environment is doing. And he predicted that as technology advanced, we would start to understand more levels of analysis. And so it's been very thrilling today to hear all these different levels of analysis represented. My work focuses primarily on two, and it's the ethological level of analysis, where we're looking at species-wide generalities. How do giraffes behave in general? How does a cormorant behave in general because it's a cormorant? What behaviors are predicted by their species affiliation? And how do those behaviors relate to their historic environment? So that's part of our work in the zoo. The other level of analysis that my work focuses on is the behavioral level. We're primarily interested in learning. We're interested in behavior that results from experience interacting with an environment. And then we keep these other levels close. We keep our medical level of analysis partners close at hand so they can look at the physiology of the organism and tell us what's working or isn't working. And neuroscience as well. We're continuing to learn more about the brain and its role as a correlate to behavior. But the bullseye on the target in my work is the behavioral level of analysis with ethology sort of close at hand. So we behave in concert with the environment. This is a great quote from B.F. Skinner, the father of behavior analysis. We, individuals, act upon the world and we change it. And we are changed in turn by the consequences of our actions. When we behave, it casts a ripple in the environment. It creates results. It makes things change around us. And that's a feedback loop, a cooperative loop, a co-influence loop. That's the word I'm looking for. We influence the environment, and the way in which the environment changes influences us back. It impacts how we'll behave again in the future, given that experience. We are so intimately connected with the world around us that the more you sort of swim in this philosophical view, the harder it is to decide where we stop and the environment begins. The environment is shaping us. It's changing our genes, and it's changing our brains, and it's changing our behavior as we interact, as we have experiences. So imagine what's missing in the life of an animal when we have not accounted for their environment. Which is often the case. We may account for the internal environment, but what's missing when we don't account for the environment around the organism, the environment in which they are behaving? All sciences are rooted in a philosophy. They're rooted in a worldview, and this is ours, a worldview of selectionism. It's all selection by consequences. There's always a consequence. The question is on what time scale is the consequence having its effect? Is it changing an individual learner, an individual organism within their lifetime? Or is it changing a species over the generations through natural selection, selection by contingencies of survival and reproduction? So Skinner said in both natural selection and learning, operant learning, that word operant is coined by Skinner, and it's drawn from the word operate. Animals operate on their environment and change it, and then they learn based on those interactions. So in both natural selection and operant learning, the result is adaptation. The result is change and a better fit to the conditions in which you're living. And it's an important point to make that the ability to learn, the ability to change what you do based on experience, has been selected for through natural selection. It's a product of evolution. And it makes sense. On a planet that is dynamic and ever-changing, of course it's selecting for organisms that are adaptable. Organisms that are fixed don't do very well on planet Earth. It changes too much within their lifetime. They've got to have some flexibility to cope with that change. So this is a great example, I think, to highlight this worldview. And I came across it with my 8-year-old daughter who wanted to learn about nudibranchs, various sea slugs. And so we were watching YouTube videos on sea slugs. And we came across this animal here. This animal looks like this animal. And this one is toxic. And fish avoid eating both of these animals. So through both learning and natural selection, we come to have a nudibranch who is not toxic, but looks just like a toxic nudibranch. That's because the fish are learning to avoid eating animals that look like this toxic animal, which has set the occasion for this selectionism, this evolutionary pressure that produces another organism who looks just this way, because the more you look like this, the less likely you are to be eaten by a fish, the longer you survive, and the more likely you are to reproduce. So both learning and natural selection are occurring here. And I was able to find a cool study where they measured whether or not fish are learning to avoid food based on its color and its shape, its morphology. And they are, no surprise to us, but here are the supporting data. So this is testing the effects of the shape. So they're first taught to eat these sea slug models, and they're palatable. And then they present them a palatable model and a non-palatable model. This has been sort of poisoned with nematocysts that taste bad. So in pre-training, that's black, they are eating both models. But post-training, after they experience the lack of palatability, the unpalatable model here, they're eating this model reduces. We didn't change this one, they didn't change this one stayed palatable. They continue to eat it at the same rate, but you see a reduction related to their predation of this shape after it's been correlated with the unpalatable nematocysts. The same thing is happening over here when what they're manipulating is color. So the shape of the models is the same, but the color is different. The fish are learning to avoid food sources based both on color and shape. And that's what drives this evolutionary process, is fish learning. Fish are learning what to eat and when, and it's selecting for the evolution of those prey species over time. So we see the world in this way, that it's selection by consequences on one of two scales, and that both of these processes are always occurring. So what is there? One more thing I wanted to say here. They're both different aspects of the same process, and that is coping with your local conditions, finding ways to survive on the planet. So we make 3 assumptions in our work to change and support behavior in the zoo. And this is the first one. Animals inherit a body, just like we talked about with the nudibranchs. So this is predicted by their species. This is driven by their genes. And Skinner said that insofar as the behavior of an organism is simply the physiology of an anatomy, how an anatomy works, the inheritance of behavior is the inheritance of certain bodily features. The body that you have is going to expedite and also hinder the acquisition of certain behavior patterns. Take a penguin, for example. A penguin is far better equipped with its anatomy to learn to swim fast for fish than it is to learn to fly for insects, right? It has a physiological limitation, an anatomical limitation for flight in the air, but it's well prepared for flight in the water. So it's going to influence what behaviors that animal acquires. They're flexible, but they're limited by their bodies. They're also expedited by their bodies to acquire certain patterns that their bodies are well suited for. Our other assumption is that it may be that animals inherit reinforcers, not behavior per se, but a susceptibility to influence by particular stimuli, that there are certain stimuli that are inherently meaningful to you given your species affiliation. And here's a cool example of that. That idea was hypothesized by Skinner in the 60s and then expanded by Baum in the 2000s. But here's a cool example coming from Georgia Mason with mink, farmed mink. So these mink are living in cages the size of this podium. And after 70 generations of captive breeding, without any access to pools of water, farmed mink, which are a semi-aquatic mammal in nature, they stick near waterways, they will still work harder to access a pool of water than a variety of other things, including more space, alternative nest sites, tunnels, raised platforms, novel objects, toys. They still show this preference for pools of water after 70 generations of captive breeding where none of them have had the opportunity to practice interacting with the water. So what accounts for that? One hypothesis is that stimulus is inherently meaningful to this species, predicted by their genes, by their species affiliation. So we work to identify what these critical stimuli are and try to put them into their environments at the zoo. And we'll show you some examples of what that looks like. So this seems like a good place to stop and make sure that we're speaking all the same language. When I say learning, we mean change. We're talking about flexibly changing what you do based on experience. And this is one of the oldest debates in all of science, says Paul Chance, who wrote a beautiful book on learning and behavior. If you had just one on your shelf, it should probably be his. It's not nature versus nurture. It's all nature. It is our nature to be nurtured by our experiences, to be shaped by our interaction with the environment. It's changing what we do, and as we learn more and more about genes in the brain, it's changing those as well. We are being influenced by our interaction with the environment. So that leads us to our third assumption when we're designing environments, when we're trying to understand behavior, that all animals inherit behavioral flexibility, which we call learning. Behavior change due to experience. And I would say now that we could probably add all organisms that need to eat, which I think makes it all living organisms, because the plants appear to be doing this as well, at least at a basic level. Plants are changing what they do in order to forage. It's just that they forage on the sun. But they are learning environmental predictors of where sunlight will come, and that's the direction that they grow in the time between the sun's availability, so that they're prepared for it when the sun returns. So plants appear to be learning as well. Here's a great example of the flexibility inherent in many species. This is the northern muriqui. They are a critically endangered primate that is found in Brazil. They're known as the hippie monkeys, if you have never heard of them before. They have a lifestyle, a social system that it revolves primarily around hugging. So they have hug sessions all throughout the day and night with each other, and that is one of the critical components of their social system. So these are the hippie monkeys of Brazil. If you haven't met them before, they are wonderful. And they are being protected in fragmented forest, and Karen Stryer has been working with them there for over 40 years. And I had the opportunity to teach at a conference with Karen many years ago and hear her account of this story. The muriquis are doing quite well in this protected, fragmented forest, and their population is growing. And so then there's pressure that comes from that. Their food supply is no longer able to support them as well. There's increased social conflict because of that. And so a group of muriquis have moved out of the forest, out of the trees. And take a look at this organism. If we're looking at the inherited anatomy, the body, this animal has evolved to live in the trees. They have these long, spindly limbs, prehensile thumbs, prehensile big toes, prehensile tails. This is an organism that is adapted through evolution to live in the trees. But given a change in local conditions, a group of muriqui left the trees to live in the grasslands that surround the forest. And they've been living there now for 10 years. They changed what they eat, they change where they sleep, they change how they move, they change how they forage, and they're succeeding. There are a group of grassland mirakees now that are doing their job well. So Karen points out that the way they're responding to this increased population density reveals their capacity for behavioral flexibility. Here's another example of that flexibility. I was teaching with Michael Brown from the Giraffe Conservation Foundation recently, and he's one of my favorite teachers because he's constantly in awe of the natural world. And he lives in Namibia, and he basically just follows giraffe around as a lifestyle and watches what they do. And he took these photos, and I asked if I could use them because I thought they were such a great demonstration of this flexibility. This is the same organism from an ethological point of view, but it's living in vastly different environments, from the forests of Murchison Falls to the deserts of Namibia. These giraffes look like they're living on Mars to me. They are adapting to those environments. From our level of analysis, this is not the same organism because it's being changed through its experience. They're learning to solve different problems. They're adapting. But what we mean by adaptation here is that they're doing something new given new conditions. They're changing their behavior within their lifetime to meet the local demands. Recently, I nearly caused an accident on the highway here because I saw turkey vultures circling, and I really wanted a video of them because when I looked up and saw them, I realized that this was the whole story. All of our assumptions were on full display on the side of the highway. They have a common body, right? They have all inherited a turkey vulture body, and they appear to have common reinforcers. They consume common food sources, and they have a common strategy for finding that food, and that is to fly in thermals. Thermals are rising columns of warm air. It has something to do with the uneven heating of the Earth's crust, but it's not my level of analysis, so that's as far as I go. The important detail is that thermals tend to be a column shape. If you have the body of a turkey vulture, and you get into a rising column of warm air, you can stay afloat without flapping your wings. You can stay afloat without expending much energy. But in order to stay in the thermal, you have to fly in a circle because the thermal is a column. So a common environment and a common body produces common behavior amongst the turkey vultures. Flying in a circle is not inherited in that animal other than it's inherited in a common body and common reinforcers. So they're brought to a common place by similar reinforcers. We could hypothesize what some of those might be. Perhaps social reinforcers of coming together with other turkey vultures. The thermal makes hunting less effortful, and ultimately this tends to lead to food. They're scanning the environment below for food. So I didn't get my video, and I didn't crash. But then I was able to find another one to share this idea that when we see common behavior amongst members of a species, it has very much to do with common reinforcers and a common body and common local conditions. But look at these birds. It's not to say that it's without variability. They don't all fly at the same speed. They don't all turn at the same rate. They're not flying at the same height within the column. There is variability from one individual to the next. Likely that is the result of selection by individual experience. They're not all doing it exactly the same. I was reading, my 8-year-old daughter and I are reading this book, Rat Rule 79, which is a hilarious book that's primarily filled with just plays on words. But at one point in the story, the protagonist makes this observation, that it is a curiously companionable feeling to have a problem that you haven't quite solved, but which you assume is not impossible. And it just jumped off the page at me because it very much is the story of my life. I have a particular problem that I'm very interested in, and it has become my companion. And we have not solved it, but I do believe that it is solvable. And I agree with the sentiment of this observation, that it is fulfilling to have this problem that you're trying to solve, that you haven't solved, but that you do believe can be solved. And this is my companion. This is my problem. So this elephant demonstrating this problem is Lulu. We'll hear more about her in a little while. But one of the major challenges in zoos today is the behavioral health of the animals that live there. And one way that we see there's a problem is through stereotypic behavior, like what Lulu's displaying here. They're defined as repetitive invariant behavior patterns, and they're commonly thought to be an indicator of a suboptimal environment. And from my level of analysis, that's where I'm looking. I'm looking to the environment and asking what's missing, because I recognize that their behavior is in large part the result of the environment. So that's where I'm looking for answers. And it's important to make the point that stereotypy itself is not the problem. It's an indicator of the problem. The problem lies in the conditions in which this elephant is behaving. So our goal is not to suppress stereotypic behavior per se. When our goal is suppression, it has us reaching for the medicine cabinet often. And that's not to say that there aren't behavior challenges where the medical level of analysis has something to offer us. So don't misunderstand my point. But my goal is to produce what's missing, the missing repertoire. What should this elephant be doing instead of this? And what does it tell us about the environment that, given her alternatives, this is the most reinforcing choice? There is a principle in behavior science called the matching law. Given the choice between two or more responses, animals will tend to choose the most reinforcing response available to them. It's so simple that some people don't even like it because it just seems obvious. But it's been quite profound in the zoo world to recognize that if an animal in your care is doing something, it's the most reinforcing something available to them in that moment. So if Lulu goes and sways back and forth for 4 hours, what does it tell me about the conditions in which she's behaving? What's missing? Reinforcers are missing that she controls with her behavior. So our goal, our mission, is to directly produce the missing repertoire. And when we've done that, as a byproduct of the missing repertoire being generated, we see a suppression in stereotypic behavior. But the suppression isn't the bullseye on our target. It's recreating the missing repertoire. Here are 3 scenarios that commonly occasion stereotypic behavior in the zoo. And as I was reading this slide just a little bit ago, it prompted me to want to share 2 quotes from B.F. Skinner as I'm typing out these constructs, fear and anticipation and boredom. These 2 quotes came to mind. The first, both from his book, The Science of Human Behavior. And the first is this: the practice of looking inside the organism for an explanation of behavior has tended to obscure the variables which are immediately available for scientific analysis. These variables lie outside the organism, in its immediate environment, and in its environmental history. And the second is this: it does not help in the solution of a practical problem to be told that some feature of an individual's behavior is due to frustration or anxiety. We also need to be told how the frustration or anxiety has been induced and how it may be altered. So you'll notice that we've taken care to operationalize what we mean when we say fear or anticipation or boredom. What we're talking about is the environment. When we say fear, we're talking about inescapable aversive stimulation. If something the animal wants to get away from has come close, and in the zoo environment, they can't get as far away from it as they would need to access relief, you'll often see them pacing or performing some other form of stereotypic behavior at whatever the farthest barrier is they can get to. So that's one scenario where we see behavior patterns like this. Another is anticipation, and by that we really mean the product of fixed time schedules for feeding and other keeper-directed events. So if I'm going to bring lunch to the elephants every day at 2 p.m., it's not surprising to start to see repetitive patterns that show up at 1:30, 1:45, and last until we appear. And then we capture that response with the delivery of sometimes just our presence or our food. And then animals learn that that's one way to control food in the captive environment, is that if I pace back and forth for long enough, without fail, the keepers show up and they have food. And then the last one, boredom, we're talking about a lack of reinforcers. And that operationalization comes from Susan Schneider, who wrote a wonderful book called The Science of Consequences. And boredom is primarily the scenario that we've been focused on at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo. It just happens to be the one that is the most prevalent across that particular facility. I don't know that that would be the case everywhere necessarily, but I suspect that it may be. So in all of these situations where we see an animal performing some sort of stereotypic response, we're responding in a similar way. We're first trying to assess the function. Function is science speak for the consequence, the purpose, the outcome. What are they getting or getting away from by behaving in that way? Anytime an organism is behaving repeatedly in a particular way, you can be confident it's attached to a meaningful outcome. That's how behavior works. It's purposeful. If we aren't getting something we want, we change what we do. That's how it works. So if they're continuing to repeat it, you can trust it's attached to some sort of meaningful outcome in the environment, and it's up to us to try and spy what that is. And then we consider natural history. What's critically important, like the pools of water to the farmed mink? What's critically important to the organism that's missing, and how can we restore it? And with it, behavioral opportunities to control access to those important stimuli. I was swimming with my daughter. My daughter's part fish, so she goes to the pool for like 9 hours and just swims the entire time. And I swam for 5 hours before I decided I had had enough time in the water, and I told her that we don't have to leave, but I have to be out of the water now. So you can keep swimming. So she went out and made a friend while she was swimming, and this friend and her, they fell in love, and they needed to exchange phone numbers so that they could swim again. And so Perrin, my daughter, came to me, and I could see this friend go to her dad, and then we kind of have like the awkward, like we're about to have to interact now, adults, because our kids are telling us we have to exchange numbers. So I met Ben, who does not work in zoos or with animals, and he works in drone defense for the Pentagon. So he's in a completely different world from any of us, right? And he asked me what I did, and so typically if you tell people that you work in a zoo, then you have to buckle up for a long conversation because they have lots of questions. And Ben asked me a question that no one has ever asked me in 20 years of working in the zoo field, and I did not have an answer for him. He asked me, what's the number one thing zoos get wrong? Such an insightful question from Ben at the pool. And I contemplated that question for several days afterwards, and I came up with my answer. The number one thing that we do wrong is we have sort of this basic system that we're using. We build boxes. They are ever fancier, but essentially we build boxes. And we put animals in them. And those boxes have two inherent problems. One, the resources that you put in there for that animal deplete quickly. And two, the boxes get dirty quickly. And so far, the zoo profession has really only come up with one solution to these two problems. You hire people, and their job is to replenish the resources in the box and to clean the box. And our solution seems to be to just hire more and more people to do that at a faster and faster rate. But I think that there is an alternative approach, and it's an approach that I think many of you may be closer to, and that's the approach of a ranch. It occurred to me that a ranch doesn't work that way. If I ran a ranch and I had a $5 million budget for the year, I wouldn't spend $4.5 million on ranch hands. It would be unlikely, but if I were a zoo, that is exactly how I'd spend it. That is what we're doing. We're spending it on ranch hands. So, of course, there is a major difference in the population density of animals at the typical zoo, animals to land, compared to the typical ranch. But I think there's a lot that we could gain from that type of thinking to move away from having keepers direct animals' days more and more heavily as a solution to instead turning to the environment and figuring out how are we going to design habitats that support animals, like a field can potentially support a herd of cattle. They don't require somebody to show up 6 times a day and provide the next meal. The land is doing that, and I think we have to start thinking that way more in the zoo profession. How are we going to design habitats that support these animals, and then we're ancillary. We're not. I agree, yes. So John Coe, who is a very influential individual around exhibit design, and he's credited with a lot of innovative habitats. When he was interviewed by New York Times in 2017 about zoos, he said even the best zoos today, even the ones where his habitats are located, they're still based on captivity and coercion. And to me, that's the fundamental flaw. And I think that he's right. It's still based on diets and schedules and cleaning, and we're making decisions for animals, and I think we have to move away from that. And tonight I'll share with you what I hope are just early examples of us heading in that direction. A couple of months ago, while I was contemplating this whole idea, I stayed up at the zoo and watched the complete sunset occur. And the way in which that mountain, for those of you who were there yesterday with me, the way that it changes over the hours that it takes for the sun to set is really incredible. It's creating challenges and opportunities for different animals all throughout that landscape. And somehow we've gotten comfortable with replacing that kind of dynamic, ever-changing set of conditions with a light switch. The lights are either on or the lights are off. We've created oversimplified physical environments, and that is why we have a lack of reinforcers. That's why we have a lack of behavioral opportunity. So in ways, I think we have to retrain ourselves to start to see things that we've come to not see anymore, like the moon phases. When the full moon is out, giraffes forage all night long, and lions don't get to hunt in nature because everybody can see them. So it changes opportunities. It creates challenges. For some organisms, it creates opportunities for others. And in the typical zoo environment, we only have lights on and lights off. So we have to look to nature and bring back some of this complexity in order for animals to be behaviorally healthy. And Hal Markowitz knew it a long time ago. And so he wrote in one of his really important books in the 80s that the rule of the wild is variety and change. The wild environment is ever changing, ebbing and flowing, and it's creating challenge and opportunity. And recently, a friend of mine went to the Oregon coast and saw this cormorant hunting, and I think it's a great example of how complex the challenges of the wild are. So the active surf is not the reason that the bird is here. The active surf is the challenge that the bird has to solve. The bird is here because fish are under there. And that's what this bird has evolved to eat. The fish are important. So it has to come up with a way to access those fish that are underneath the active surf. And it's using its body, it's using its inherited anatomy to do it, but it's also using its behavior. It's learning how to do this. And if you watch the way the bird times its dives, it does not get hit by waves. So it's coming up and taking a breath, and then as the next wave approaches, it fishes again. It's avoiding contact with the waves and controlling access to the fish with its behavior. That's something this individual learned to do to meet the demands of the active surf. So I'm not suggesting that we necessarily have to give that bird the active surf in order for it to thrive. But if we're not going to give it the active surf, we have to get creative, and we have to come up with some other challenge for it to use its behavior to solve. That's what behavior evolved to do. In that presentation I quoted on the very first slide from Hal Markowitz in 1975, he said that there is much we don't know about behavior, but there is one simple truth. The vast majority of species seem to thrive in environments that present them with some challenges. In many ways, we've taken the challenges out of zoo animal life, and we've done it for their best interests, so we thought. And now we're able to see that there's fallout from that. It makes sense that those decisions were made by the past generations when animals in zoos were not living lifespans comparable to their wild counterparts, or they weren't reproducing successfully. Nobody was walking around thinking, I should make this animal's life more challenging. It doesn't make sense that no one would have that idea at that time. You would have other ideas. You would be changing how you feed them. You would be changing social systems. You would be looking at reproductive care, their physiological health. And that's what zoos have been doing. And they've come a very long way in the last 40 years. Most species live much longer lives in human care than they do in the wild environment. But now that those problems have been, I wouldn't say solved, but greatly improved upon, it's allowing our generation, this generation, to see the fallout of these overly simplified environments that don't have challenges, where everything is done for you, everything's taken care of, you're on a meal plan, the food is processed, we've got keepers taking care of making sure they're chopped into just the right size. There's nothing left for them to do with their behavior. So many of them are filling that void with stereotypic behavior instead. Rather than do nothing, they're doing something. So we've got to give them a job to do. This idea of emergence has been around for a long time. Some say all the way back to Aristotle. But I've been coming across it a lot lately, so it's been on my mind. And what we're really talking about here is the existence or formation of collective behaviors, what parts of a system do together that they would not do alone. And two great animal examples are geese flying in a V. If we looked at an individual goose and we thought about how it might move through its environment, it's unlikely that we would predict that they would fly in a V shape. But after the fact, once we see it happen, we can analyze it and understand why. They fly in the V shape probably for two reasons. One, it's reducing drag to fly in just this position. This bird is creating an uplift that this bird gets to capitalize on. And it's also positions you so that you can keep your eye on the flock and make sure that you all stay together. So once we see it happen, it's sensible. It's available to sort of after-the-fact analysis. Now it makes sense. But if you just looked at one component, one part of the puzzle, I don't know that we'd ever predict that that's what they're going to do together. And the same is true for these cathedral termite mounds. If we studied an individual termite, none of us would ever predict that if you get them together, that's what they build. But it is what they build. And now that we've seen them build it, now that we see it and we can analyze it, we can recognize that that is what you build to control the climate perfectly if you are that organism. It controls the temperature and the humidity just the way that they need to build that structure. So after the fact analysis, it makes sense. But beforehand, we would not predict that has happened, that would happen. And the oldest termite mound that is still occupied is 34,000 years old, they estimate, in South Africa. So it is working for them. But it's not something that we would predict. So it leaves us with this question, I think, which is how much of the system can you remove from the animal's life before there isn't enough for anything healthy to emerge? And that's what we have our eye on now in the zoo. What's missing from the system that we need to put back in the environment that will allow healthful behavior to emerge? So we have a shift in focus. Our focus is less on the behavior, a specific behavior, and more on the meaningful outcomes of behaving, which we call reinforcers in behavior analysis. We're talking about engineering responsive environments, engineering conditions that are sensitive to behavior, that change when animals operate on them. Concrete and glass and steel don't change, so they don't respond to you in any way when you act on them. So we're trying to design environments that respond. And then to provide meaningful reinforcers. Once we provide meaningful reinforcers, and that word, there's a lot of meaning baked into that word, reinforcer. We mean that it is a result that depends on a response from the animal. It depends on behavior, and it strengthens the behavior that it depends on. It's the purpose for behavior. That's what behavior evolved to do, to control reinforcers, to change the world around you in ways that you want. When we provide those reinforcers, then what we call free operant behavior will follow, where learned behavior that is free from the constraints of our direction emerges. Where there are reinforcers, behavior emerges to control them within the biological limits of that organism, like we talked about. The penguins are probably not going to take flight through the air tomorrow morning, regardless of where the reinforcers are. But many people are surprised to see 15 African lions in a tree. It's not something that we are accustomed to seeing, and it's not that common. It's common in a particular place in Africa where trees grow that are this shape. It creates an opportunity for them to get shade, get up off the ground, and rest comfortably. So when a tree like this is present, behavior emerges to control these rest reinforcers, and we see entire prides of lions spending days up in a tree. So here's an example of that at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, of what it looks like to focus not on the behavior per se, but on its meaningful outcomes, on its reinforcers. Behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's dependent on conditions. Behavior and conditions are an inseparable unit. So we're talking about what conditions do we need to provide to allow behavior to emerge and control them. So this keeper team, they had asked me if we would start delivering them buckets full of sticks because they saw that the penguins were using the sticks to build nests. So they asked if we could start delivering them buckets of sticks, and we have an environmental enhancements team at the zoo. So this is what we do. We try to support the maintenance and development of these types of enrichment programs. So they asked us if we would deliver them sticks so penguins could build nests. They would give the penguins the sticks, and they could build nests out of them. And I said no. And the reason that I said no is I wanted to better understand what can we learn about penguins' nest building material preferences. What are the stimuli that are likely to be most important to a penguin? I know we have the anecdotal observation of them using sticks, but let's do a little bit of an analysis. And when we did, we found this wonderful paper that had evaluated nearly 1,600 wild African penguin nests. And then they had categorized the nests based on the materials that the nests included. And so out of those nearly 1,600 nests, the vast majority, nearly 600 nests, they were made entirely out of soft material. Grasses, leaves, and feathers, which makes sense. They put their eggs in there. So, of course, they're using soft material. The next biggest group is using a mixture. They're using a mixture of some hard and some soft material. And then the smallest portion of the nests use only hard materials. So rather than provide just twigs, we provided a variety. We provided grasses, we provided leaves, feathers, and sticks. And then rather than give them directly to the penguins, we made them available in the environment, but dependent on the behavior of the penguins. So we put them out in the bushes and on rocks and in the sand and floating in the water. And then we left penguins in an environment that's now rich with something that we predict is going to matter to them. Independent of our direction, now it's up to them to come up with a way to control those reinforcers. And here's what this penguin came up with. So she's just returning, and she's filled her beak with grasses. To do this, she would have had to go all over the beach and pick up single blade by single blade to get this beak full. She can go back by land, but she's choosing to swim them back underwater. That is free operant behavior. That behavior emerges in an environment that has reinforcers, and we step back and the penguin innovates. The penguin uses its existing repertoire and comes up with a solution on its own. Nobody had the goal that a penguin would swim a beak full of grass underwater to get it back and build the nest. The goal for the keepers was just nest building. But when we focused on directing, rather than directing nest building, just directing the environment, additional behavior emerged. So that leads us to this idea, this free operant approach that we've been exploring at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo for the last 7 years now or so. This work, as with most of my work, has been done in close partnership with Susan Friedman. She's the one who brought me into contact with the free operant concept that I had not come across in my reading and behavior analysis or in any of my work, but she was familiar with because it's very present in the special education community where she started her career and spent 20 years. So in the early days when we were working with elephants, which I'll show you here in a bit, she was starting to ask me questions about what was different about what we were doing. We were having success that past attempts at environmental enrichment didn't have, so why? Ever the analyst, Susan's asking me, what's different? What are you doing differently? And in my description, she said it reminds me of Ogden Lindsley's work around free operant behavior. So we picked up Ogden's paper that he wrote on this in 1996, where he identified 4 free operant freedoms. And they really clarified the work that we were doing and helped us do it better. And these are the 4 free operant freedoms that he identified. The first is the freedom to present stimuli, which I've come to, I think, describe most clearly as the freedom to initiate. Ogden was working with children, and one of his examples was around the use of flashcards. And one of the freedoms is the freedom to present stimuli. So rather than the instructor presenting the flashcards, he would always give the child control over the cards. So they have the freedom to self-present the flashcard. But in the animal context, I think freedom to initiate is the clearest way to describe it. That penguin is free to initiate nest-building behavior at any time because she's living in an environment full of opportunity to go collect nest material. So she has the freedom to initiate. The second is the freedom to repeat responses many times to each signal. Animals don't have that in a typical discrete trial training session. That's the science speak for the type of training that we're all doing with animals. We deliver the cue, they have the opportunity to respond. Their next opportunity to respond only comes the next time we choose to deliver the cue. So they don't have the freedom to repeat responses many times to each signal. Think about kids on a playground, think about a slide. Kids can repeat responses to the signal, to the presence of the slide, as many times as they choose. The next is the freedom to form responses, to inventively select and vary the most comfortable responses to overcome both boredom and fatigue. We see that with that penguin. None of us would have come up with that solution to the problem, but that individual penguin did. You see the same thing with kids in a slide, all the variety of ways in which they choose to go down. They're free to form their own responses. That freedom is also typically not present in a discrete trial training session because we've decided what the form is, and we need to. If I train a lion to present its tail to me so I can draw blood, I'm not really looking for the tail to come to me in 201 ways. I have a particular way I'm looking for the tail to come to me, and so that narrow variability is just what we want. In a discrete trial training scenario. But outside of that interaction, we want them to be able to come up with their own behavior, to form their own responses. And then the last is the freedom to speed or slow responses, to decide the pace. So now, with Ogden's beautiful operationalization of those freedoms, that's the ball we have our eye on. As we're designing an environment, I'm trying to look at those boxes and see if the operant is free. In this work, over the last 7 years, 4 key stimulus features have emerged that greatly influence the success of these programs. The first is resource depletion. We're talking about the consumption of a resource faster than it can be replenished. If the reinforcer is depleted, if it's absent, there's no longer an opportunity to behave for it, right? So they're again left in an environment in deficit. The second is satiation. We're used to using that word around food, and it's a good example of it, but it occurs with a variety of reinforcers, with any reinforcer. We're talking about the reduction in the reinforcing effects of a stimulus after repeated or prolonged exposure. And a behavior to produce that reinforcer is going to be less likely to occur if satiation has occurred. So if I've just eaten, 2 whole pizzas, I'm less likely to behave in ways that result in food. And these are ebbing and flowing all the time. Some reinforcers are faster to satiate than others. I was just reading an example sometime today of the idea of running on a treadmill. And at some point, you get off the treadmill, and now you've satiated on running reinforcers. You're not going to be likely to pursue running again for some period of time. A good example of satiation is with giraffe. Those of you that were with me yesterday, you were pointing out the alfalfa or the lucerne. Depending on where you are in the world, you have different names for it. It's a great example of satiation. It's something that's available to giraffe in human care 24/7, but they interact with it very little. A few bites of that reinforcer and it satiates. It's not something that they'll spend a long time eating in general. The third feature is dosage. We mean the relative representation or strength of something. We often fail to change behavior because we come in with just too small of a dose. It's not that we picked the wrong stimuli, it's just that we came in too small. And that's common in the zoo community, I think as a product of the way keepers' days tend to be scheduled. So they have many animals to visit in their 8-hour day, and so they may have 20 or 30 minutes at each of these places. So they go to the bear exhibit, they've got 25 minutes. Their job is to bring the bears inside, clean the outside, put out the day's food, enrich the habitat in some way, maybe do a cooperative care training session, deliver medications, vitamins, etc. So environmental enrichment has this 5-minute time allocated to it. So they come in with a very small dose of whatever it is they're going to give because it's all they can produce in that amount of time. So a recent example of this was with African lions. African lions really like to roll around in elephant poop. So they will roll and get it all over themselves and they'll eat it. So they tend to be very interactive with that stimulus. Keepers were providing them a shovel full of elephant poop and getting a little bit of interaction, and then lions are going back to, pacing. So Jason, who's my partner in crime in many of these efforts at the zoo, he's the curator of these programs now, just recently. He and I decided that we wanted to test what happens if you put an entire wheelbarrow of elephant poop in the lion habitat. And then, for good measure, let's put another wheelbarrow full of used elephant browse in the habitat. And when we do that, we see lions rolling, rubbing, wrestling for hours, and then sleeping after all of that activity. So the keepers had identified the right stimulus, a meaningful stimulus to the lions, one that would evoke engagement. But they had come in at too small of a dose to have the impact that we were looking for. So dosage is another a factor to consider. And then one that's occurred to us more recently is intermittence. In this case, we're looking for animals to persistently engage in solving a problem. And we're looking for resources to deplete more slowly. And we can get at both of those by making their success more intermittent. So not every attempt at this problem is resulting in success. I was talking to some folks at the zoo yesterday that our work in this environmental enrichment area is in many ways the antithesis of what we do in a discrete trial training session. In a training session, we're looking to arrange antecedents so the right answer is the only answer. And the rate of reinforcement is high. I'm not looking for them to persist in the absence of reinforcement much of the time because I'm there to deliver the reinforcer. But in this case, I do want them to work to solve the problem for a long period of time. And I want that reinforcer to persist in the environment for a long period of time. So we're creating challenges that are hard, where you fail a lot. And that produces animals who work for a long period of time to solve that problem. And I've got some examples of what that looks like for you. So now we've come full circle back to Lulu. Elephants is where this all began for us. So I owe a lot to these elephants. They've taught me a lot about how the world works. And we were running this environmental enrichment intervention with them, trying to free up operant behavior. We were providing mud wallows. We were providing big barked logs, dry substrate mounds of both sand and soft, like this screened topsoil, softest dirt you can find. And then we were varying the presentation of all of these things. And for 4 out of 5 individual elephants, their behavior suggested that it was effective. We saw a suppression of stereotypic behavior and the emergence of a variety of behaviors engaging with those reinforcers. But Lulu continued to sway in the presence of that intervention. And this is when Susan came across the dosage insight. She came up with the dosage insight that maybe we had failed to change behavior because we had come in too small for Lulu. So we took what was 10 puzzle feeders and we made it 18. We took 10 foraging locations and made it 50. We scattered buried food around the perimeter, about a half-mile perimeter of the yard. And then we continued to have logs with bark, wallows, sand mounds, and dirt mounds. And in the presence of the increased dosage, Lulu's behavior changed. We produced the missing repertoire. This is what emerged in the presence of the increased dosage. So this is the goal. The goal is to produce this missing repertoire. A byproduct of this is less swaying. That beeping sound is my phone telling me to collect data. You'll hear it in every video for the rest of this presentation, probably. So at the end of the day, this is Lulu now in the presence of that intervention with the increased dosage. This first elephant is Missy. This is Lulu's best friend. Keepers are asking these two elephants to come into the barn so they can do some training. Missy comes right on in, but that's Lulu. Lulu is ignoring the signal to come into the barn because the reinforcers in the yard now outcompete the reinforcers available in the barn. So from Jason and I's point of view, this is a huge success. The keepers maybe disagree. But this is what we're looking for, to finally alter that yard in a way that it can compete and outcompete the opportunity to come interact with a keeper. Prior to these changes, she was waiting at that door that Missy just walked through 2 hours before keepers ever show up. And that waiting looks like swaying back and forth, and eventually the keepers arrive and there's an opportunity to behave for effect. So it's a really exciting shift to see, to go from waiting for 2 hours to completely ignoring the opportunity to go in. She has more reinforcers to control in the yard. So now the keepers go get Lulu 45 minutes later than they historically have gone, because if they go any earlier, she doesn't come in, and it's a waste of their time. So they've changed Lulu's schedule because she's busy. And that's our goal. That's our goal. They should be busy engaging with the world around them. So here are the data surrounding our work with elephants. And I'll just orient you to the format of this graph quick. And this will be the same way all of the graphs look as we move ahead together. So each of these dark vertical lines represent a phase change. That's us changing something in the environment. And then we're tracking behavior continuously throughout these changes using the same methodology across the phase changes. We're not in the laboratory, but to the best of our ability, we're trying to make the only thing that's changing is our manipulation of the environment. We're trying to get feedback about what effect our changes are having on the behaviors of interest. This graph is very busy. It looks like something a toddler did for us. But I just want to point out a couple of key elements here. So the stereotypy is represented by the red data points. Foraging is green, and then interaction with other aspects of the environment, like the wallows, the mounds, and the logs, is represented by the blue data. And these are our iterations. We first presented wallows. We created, they always had a wallow, but we created really robust wallows with that screen topsoil I was talking about. We added water every day. It's about as big as the floor area up here at the front of the room. And so we were really curating this nice wallow, and we produced a lot of interaction with the wallow, a lot of enthusiasm and engagement, but we learned that wallows satiate quickly and for long periods of time. The purpose of wallowing for an elephant is to stay cool, to get protection from insects. Once an elephant's body is totally covered in mud, they are much less likely to wallow again until that mud comes off, which is sometimes days later. So we get this really exciting wallowing event, and then we'll see you again next Tuesday. So wallows alone are insufficient. So it informs the next iteration to come in. We still want to preserve wallows. It produced some exciting responses, but alone insufficient. So we iterate. We iterated to adding logs and dry mounds. Then we started varying the presentation, so the places that these things were every day were unpredictable. Now you'd have to go out and try to find, where did they move the wallow last night? So Jason was spending 8 hours a night in this yard redesigning it, so they would have something to go search for. And then here's follow-up several months later. But take a look at what happens when we increase the dosage. This is Lulu's behavior that we're looking at. When we come in with the high dosage, the presence of stereotypy plummets, and it just disappears. It disappears in the presence of that environment. So while suppressing stereotypy is not the primary goal, it does seem to be a very nice measure from a science point of view. It seems highly sensitive to the quality of the environment, so it provides us beautiful, immediate feedback when we've got it right. So this is what I'm looking for. Until I see this, I assume I'm wrong. And we just keep iterating, informed by the past revisions, until we get the results that we're looking for. All right, on to the penguins. We have penguins and live rainbow trout living together, which is unusual. You guys got the chance to see that yesterday for those of you that were at the zoo. So before I talk about the benefits to the penguins, we have to spend a little bit of time talking about the trout. There are ethical concerns around predators having the opportunity to eat live prey in human care. It's few and far between where we do this, primarily because we're concerned about guests' impression, guests' opinion about that practice, and also we're concerned about the well-being of the prey animal who has to experience being hunted and eaten. So in order to do this, we try to protect the welfare of the trout to the greatest extent possible while still allowing some percentage of them to be eaten by penguins. So that's the balance that we're trying to strike here. So for starters, we try to provide an environment that gives the trout fair chase. This idea that they can authentically win this game. It's not rigged in the penguins' favor. So we've provided artificial hides all throughout the pool system that look similar to what wild rainbow trout use to hide from their predators. We also introduced the trout into the penguin pool system at a time where there are no penguins. So trout have an opportunity to get familiar with the environment before the predators arrive. Trout live in a holding facility that is tapped into the same life support system as the penguin pool. That's the same water quality system. So when they're transported from one pool to the next, there's no change in temperature or pH, both of which have a negative physiological impact on the fish. So we're trying to protect them from that stress. We're also trying to reduce distress to the greatest extent that we can for the fish who are captured. And we've observed that penguins are very efficient killers of rainbow trout that are 4 to 6 inches in length. So that's the size that we acquire and introduce into the pool system. And we have some supporting evidence that we've done this effectively, that we've supported rainbow trout. And that is that we've had several dozen rainbow trout survive in the pool, coming in as 4-inch trout, and live to be nearly the size of African penguins. At which point, the penguins stop hunting them and the trout stop hiding. So that's very interesting. They start to coexist once the trout are big. And then there are several areas in the pool system where trout can go and penguins can't, so they utilize those. We talked about this at the zoo yesterday. Penguins come in from the outdoor pool every day at around 3:30, and at about 3:35, the outdoor pool is full of rainbow trout, who have all emerged from hiding because they've learned the schedule of the penguins. So there's some very cool trout learning going on as well. So now let's take a look at it from the penguin's point of view, so to speak. This is the first time our individual penguins ever had access to a live fish. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? It doesn't look like hunting behavior to me. Those hunting skills are not inside that animal, waiting to just be popped out as soon as a fish appears. They're acquired. They're acquired through experience these penguins have never had. They do appear to be naturally interested in shiny things that move around in water. And so back to that idea from Skinner, that perhaps what they're inheriting is a body and reinforcers, and then behavior is coming through experience. So here's what they looked like just 3 weeks later. So they're swimming much faster, and they're working in a group, neither of which we ever saw prior to exposure to rainbow trout. They're looking to locate hiding trout, corral them to the surface, and catch them. So there's a fish at the top. I thought they were going to catch it right in front of the camera, so I was thrilled to look at this video, and they caught it behind the camera, so we didn't get to see it happen. So interestingly, this is a similar hunting pattern that you'll see if you watch a video of wild penguins hunting off the coast of South Africa. They are corralling fish to the surface and catching them there. One hypothesis as to why that pattern emerges is that it's easier to catch something. If you're trying to catch something who can move in every direction, it's in your best interest to go somewhere that takes one of those directions out of the equation. If you bring them to the surface, at least they can't go up, and it gets easier to catch them. That's my hypothesis anyways. So that's how they do this. And sometimes we see them spending up to 2 hours in groups of 6 to 8 penguins hunting. We have a brother-sister pair that I've seen hunt for 6 continuous hours. That's that persistent engagement that we're talking about, born in part by intermittence. This behavior is shaped, and their success is intermittent. So they swim after a fish, and the fish swims away. The longer they go without access to that fish, the harder they work to get it. Its value is increasing. So they swim a little faster, they swim a little harder. What happens when they swim a little faster or when they swim with a friend? They catch a fish. That fish is selecting for that hunting pattern, for swimming faster and for working in a group, so they do it more. It's reinforced by access to the fish. When 8 penguins are out there hunting, only 1 penguin eats that fish every single time. So access to the fish by each individual is intermittent, but they persist for long periods of time in the hunting party for their chance to get the fish. Think about the casino. It's like they're sitting at the slot machine. One of these pulls out, it's going to be me. We saw some really cool nuanced changes in their swimming patterns once they were exposed to rainbow trout, once they were working for this reinforcer. Take a look at how they manage their breathing while they're hunting. This penguin is exhaling all of the air before it surfaces, so it can inhale immediately and get back underwater. What we just watched happens in less than 2 seconds. This penguin is maximizing its speed. It's maximizing time underwater, which it never did before because it had no reason to do it before. What would be the reinforcer for swimming that way if not a fish? Before fish were in this pool, our penguins swam around on the surface like ducks. It was just about getting from point A to point B, and they did it leisurely. We were missing the reinforcer that allows this repertoire to emerge. So here are our penguin data. Same style of graph that we saw with elephants. Our baseline report is anecdotal. They swam very little when this habitat was opened. Our director wasn't too happy about that. So he tasked me with solving that problem. We talked about this at the zoo the other day, and we won't spend too much time on it today, but we ended up increasing their time in the water by changing the arrangement of the land. We came to the hypothesis that, based on our observations, they use these caves to nest in. Basically, if you're an African penguin, one of the things you care about is something with 3 sides and a lid. It can be made of anything. If it's that shape, a penguin will go in it. An African penguin will anyways. And we noticed that they were spending most of their time in those caves during this period of time, and they were competing for the most preferred cave sections. And our hypothesis was that there are fewer preferred caves than there are pairs of penguins. Think about Daytona Beach, there's 4 umbrellas. If your family has one, the whole family's never going in the water, because when you get back, you're gonna have lost that umbrella to somebody else. So that was our hypothesis, that if you went in the water, when you came out, you'd have lost your cave, and the cost was too high to swim, so swimming was suppressed. So we renovated a brand new habitat based on that analysis, like a $3 million facility that had been open for 2 months. And I asked our director for $100,000 to rebuild it to get penguins to swim, which he did do. And we saw an immediate increase in swimming, like flipping a light switch. As soon as we brought penguins back into the new habitat, they were in the water every day, throughout the day. So that's what this B phase represents. And then we're interested in lasting behavior change. We're not interested in giving animals a really great Tuesday. This isn't the birthday party intervention. We're trying to give them a great lifestyle that lasts. And so we come back 3 months later, 4 months later. I just took 2-year follow-up data with our penguins, because that's what we want to see, that this intervention matters and that it keeps mattering every day throughout the life of those individuals. So this is 4-month follow-up of the cave intervention. This is 1-year follow-up. And then take a look at what happens when we introduce live trout into the environment. It's a significant bump in time spent in the water. Each of these data points represents the total amount of time out of a 3-hour observation period that a member of the flock was actively swimming. So now they're getting upwards of 75, 80% of an observation period. So that's 2.5 hours of swimming about, just a little less, out of a 3-hour observation period. Prior to this, I had never seen an animal in a zoo engage with a behavioral opportunity for that kind of duration. So I don't have it on this graph yet. I need to update it, but I just followed up 2 years now they've been living with trout. And on our 2 3-hour samples, they swam for 78% and then 93% of that observation period. So that's 2 years later. A rival hypothesis to some of this success is that it's novelty that's producing all this engagement. You're coming in and changing things in really novel ways, and so you're producing engagement because it's novel. But if that's the case, we'd expect that engagement will reduce as novelty naturally fades. So we're testing for that by following up 2 years later. If they were chasing fish because fish were novel, we wouldn't expect them to be chasing fish 2 years later. So I think it's something more than that. So here we are, back to a hoofed creature. So this is about as close as I'll get you to a horse tonight. So giraffe and browse is a nice example of the depletion problem. Giraffe are an obligate browser. Leaves and bark is 100% what they eat. They don't eat grasses, they don't eat other plants, they eat trees. They eat a variety of trees, but it's all trees. And so when we're looking for those important stimuli, those meaningful stimuli, browse is definitely at the top of the list for a giraffe. And we have a pretty cool program that Jason started. It's been running for 12 years now, I think, 13 years maybe. We work with local arborists who are trimming trees all throughout Colorado Springs. We have a full-time staff person we call the browse hustler. Their job is to get trees onto zoo grounds, and they partner with arborists to do it. So we build relationships, we bring donuts to them, we make friends, they get to meet elephants, whatever we need to do. So that when you're gonna chop a tree down, all you have to do is send us the address, and we will come, and you don't have to pick it up and mulch it. We'll pick it up, we'll clean it up, and we'll take it to the zoo. So during the growing season, we bring about 2,000 pounds of browse material to the zoo every day, and it primarily goes to elephants and giraffes. So that program is very cool, very exciting, and certainly benefits the animals. But take a look at giraffe eating those trees in the conventional way that we've provided them over these years. They are taking mouthfuls like we were of those burgers at lunch. It's as much leaf material as they can get in their mouth, and they're depleting it fast. So this is about 50 pounds of browse, and these 3 or 4 giraffe will deplete it in less than 30 minutes. And by that I mean all the leaves are gone and the bark is stripped bare. So Jason and I did the math one day. We had numerous observations of this much browse weight, this many giraffe, took this much time to deplete it. Wild activity budget for giraffe tends to look like about 75% active foraging. That's 16 hours a day that they are spending working for leaf material. So we did the math. Given how quickly they're depleting this weight of branches, what would it take for us to get 16 giraffe, that's how many live at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, to actively forage for 16 hours? And we needed 5,000 pounds of browse a day. So that is unattainable for us. But it also begs the question, does nature provide them with that? I asked Jason, what place in Africa is providing 4 giraffe with that kind of browse material? Every herd of 16 has 5,000 pounds of tree material a day. It just doesn't make sense. So we started talking to Michael Brown about that, and he sent us some videos of wild giraffe foraging. Wild giraffe are solving a much more complicated problem. The trees that they're eating, for one thing, are alive, and they want to keep their leaves. That's how they eat. That's how they photosynthesize. So one of their primary prey species is the acacia tree, and it has grown thorns. It's been evolving alongside these predators for eons, and it has thorns that they have to avoid. It also has a symbiotic relationship with the acacia ant. that does not want its home to be destroyed. The acacia ant learns the vibrations of browsers and comes out and attacks them. So it's in this giraffe's best interest to keep the tree from moving very much, and it's using its anatomy and physiology to solve this problem. It's using its prehensile lip and prehensile tongue, and it's removing little leaf by leaf. This is why a wild giraffe spends 16 hours a day foraging. It's a 2,000-pound animal, and it is acquiring energy very slowly. It's not like the type of situation that we're providing the zoo giraffe. There are a couple of species where they can do that, some species where they can take mouthfuls, and Michael says that is indeed what they do, but that species is not always available to them. So a lot of the time they're having to solve a problem like this. So based on that, we developed this prototype. Our goal is to increase the behavior requirement to control this reinforcer and to slow down the depletion. So when this giraffe comes back here on the right, she'll give us a good example. Now the form of behavior is starting to look a lot more like the wild behavior. She's having to utilize her prehensile tongue and lips to access that meaningful outcome. And it's slowing the depletion of the leaves. So here are the data that we collected in this pilot test of that feeder, which we affectionately call the Michael Brown now. These are browse trials. The gray columns represent a free-hanging browse trial, like you saw in the first video. The green column represents the mesh feeder. In each of these trials, we use the same individuals. After group 1, we switched to these 3 for the rest of our pilot test. We counterbalanced the order in which these were presented to test for any order effects or effects of satiation. And the way these trials would run, last thing, is we did our very best to create 2 equal piles of browse. Trees are not growing equally, so it's a little bit complicated to do. So our parameters were 15 pounds, weight on a scale, 4 to 5 pieces, 5 to 6 feet in length, and we measured them at their largest diameter to be either 3/4 to 1.5 inches. That was our range. So you had to fall into these parameters. Obviously, if I put more browse in the cylinder than I'm putting as free hanging, then I have a huge lurker variable that could explain the change. So we're trying to get 2 equal piles of browse as best we can. And the way this worked is that we would provide either the free hanging browse or the cylinder, and then we would observe until one of 2 things happened. Either all of the leaves were gone, or they went 3 consecutive minutes without engaging with browse, at which point that trial was terminated and we presented the next one, free hanging or cylinder, whatever wasn't first, and then it would be done. So you can see that the cylinder almost always doubles, sometimes triples, the total time giraffes spent browsing. That was what we were measuring here. How much time are they actively foraging? Another interesting observation is that in all of the cylinder trials, leaves remained when the trial was suspended. They went off and did other things for 3 minutes and we stopped watching. In all of the free-hanging trials, it ended because they had eaten all the leaves. So not only are they spending more time engaged in leaves with the cylinder, there are still leaves remaining when they go do something else. In all of these trials, the leaves are gone. That's what signals the end. So we wanted to know 2 things. 1, is it physically possible to get all the leaves out, or have we made it too hard? And then 2, if it is possible, how long does it take? So we provided this same arrangement to an individual giraffe overnight, which in the zoo world typically means 16 hours, where this individual had free access to the browse cylinder with no competition for 16 hours. He did remove all of the leaves, so he was able to succeed. No leaves left in the cylinder the next morning. We had him on camera. It took him 15.5 hours to do the job. And across that 15.5 hours of time, he actively foraged for 4.5 hours. So the operant is more free. He was coming and going, initiating, browsing for as long as he wanted, then going to do something else. But we were able to go home, and for the entire time that we were away from the zoo, that giraffe had control over foraging, much more like his wild counterpart. That's really the aspect of the wild environment that I think we most have to bring into the zoo. It's not that it looks natural per se, it's that the operant is free. These animals are always living in a world where they're free to initiate, to start working for the things that they want. What's required of them will change, But African lions don't wake up in Africa without prey. There's always prey somewhere. What's required to get it will change, and they make choices about whether or not they're going to do that work, but they can always choose to initiate it. But that's not the case in the zoo, and I think it needs to be. So here's our last example, North American beaver. So think back to the start of this presentation with Lulu. What's wrong with an environment where the most reinforcing choice is to go and paw at this non-responsive pane of glass? It suggests that something is missing. Something's missing from the environment. And I would consider this individual to be low arousal. She's relatively relaxed. She's not piloerect. You'll see her walk to another spot in a moment. There's no fast movement. But there's also nothing else to do in here. She's living in a concrete bowl. So this is the problem. And we started to get to work on the environment. It's become clear to us that if you want to know what are the critical features of an environment for a particular species, then you should ask someone who studies them in the wild how they find their subjects. Ecologists and ethologists, they do not wander the wilds aimlessly, hoping to bump into a pygmy mouse lemur. They have some idea of how to find them. And what they may not know is that what they know are these reinforcers. Animals who can freely move through the wild environment don't. They go to predictable places. Those places have a set of conditions that matter to that organism. So if you ask them how to find an American beaver, they give you this answer. You will find them where there's running water. You will find them where there is abundant vegetation. And the base of that running water will be some manipulable substrate. It's not going to be boulders, most likely. Those are the places you're most likely to find American beaver. So that gives us an idea of what's important: moving water, vegetation, and a mud base. So we provided them with a lot of branches, which were coming to us from giraffe. So we took all the used giraffe branches, which we have truckloads of, and delivering them to beavers. So this is the new giraffe recycling program. So it goes to beavers next. And I had asked for money to build a stream to allow them to potentially dam it up. And after my series of successes getting money from our director, I thought this was a slam dunk. Need $20,000, build a river, it'll work, just like everything else. And he said no, which shocked me, and sent me back to the drawing board. And I had found, when I went back to the literature, I found a couple of examples where, with wild beaver, researchers had evoked dam building by playing the sound of running water out of a speaker. And wild beavers showed up and dammed up the speaker. One was inside someone's pickup truck. They dammed up the truck. So I bought a speaker instead, grabbed an old iPhone, and we started playing the sound of running water overnight in the environment. And we saw an immediate shift in their behavior. They stopped pawing the glass, and they started interacting with the branches. But they didn't build anything, which was okay. Jason and I are chatting during this video, trying to decide if she's moving them in some sort of deliberate fashion or if it's just random. We're kind of wishfully hoping that there's some sort of design here, but there doesn't turn out to be. But we had successfully outcompeted whatever the reinforcers were for pawing the glass. Now she's interacting with the branches instead. And they did this for 12 days. For 12 days, they did not paw glass, and they pushed branches around. And on the 12th day, I was watching them, and I saw one of them go to the back of the habitat, which has a mud base, and they started digging a hole. And I realized that I had made an error. I was playing the river sounds over concrete. And so that night, I moved the speaker to the place where they were digging the hole. And this is what they did. So this is the first time that they've ever taken a branch out of the water. And she's really quite bad at it. So if you watch, she's quite clumsy. But she's never done it before. So the speaker is sitting right up here by the date here, the 2. And they always do this after they place a branch. They sort of rear up and look around. You can see, even though she's not directly involved, she's also doing that behavior, so that's interesting. And then it's followed by one of two things. They either adjust the branch that they've just brought, or they go get the next one. So this is about a week later. This is the same dam. And look at how much more fluency she has in bringing the branches out. And they've actually brought all of the snow into this as well. So they're taking handfuls of snow and packing it around the branches. So they now maintain 2 dam structures, and they've been doing it for 18 months. One dams up the door that keepers use to enter, and the other one creates a ramp that allows them to walk out into the zoo. So we allow them to build freely until either they can leave or the keepers can't get in, and then we do a little destruction, and then they repair. But they continue to maintain those dams. And I skipped over the data for this one because I've decided it should come in this order. But I do want you to see it. It's the data that actually sent me back to Lulu, the elephant. So when we came in, our very first intervention produced this change, this immediate absence of interacting with the glass and pawing at the walls. It's very exciting to produce data like these. They don't always look like this. They often require many iterations. But when I saw these data, the response from the beavers, I went back to Lulu, the elephant. So remember, for 4 other elephants, the intervention was adequate. And Lulu was also engaging in that intervention, but she continued to sway. And I had the hypothesis that maybe I was too late to the party. Lulu had a 30-year history of swaying, and maybe it would be too difficult for me to change it. So I sort of let myself off the hook. But when I saw these data, I went right back to Lulu. I was confident that animals will not perform stereotypic behavior in an environment that is adequate. And we went back and came up with the dosage idea, and sure enough, Lulu's behavior makes the same shift once we get it right. Another interesting observation related to beavers is this paper bag that's full of pieces of cardboard. It's very representative of typical environmental enrichment in the modern zoo. We give animals things, novel things, and they interact with them. Beavers always tear this up. So if I'm a keeper of the beavers, I come in and I'm setting up their habitat and I take the time to give them all that cardboard. When I come back tomorrow, it'll be torn to shreds. So it reinforces my behavior of giving them the cardboard. They engaged, I do it again. And that tends to be what enrichment looks like. When I took this picture, that paper bag had been hanging there for 2 weeks. It is untouched. They abandoned interacting with typical environmental enrichment as rapidly as they abandoned interacting with the non-responsive glass. This is arbitrary. This is not meaningful to a beaver. It's only meaningful when they're living in deficit. But when they're living in an environment rich with meaningful opportunities, this is no more interesting to them than the glass panel. So it was very interesting to see how quickly they abandoned some of our conventional enrichment strategies. So that's our goal. Our crux strategy is to replace arbitrary things with meaningful reinforcers. So it's impossible to give this talk with this title, talking about the importance of learning, and not have this guy come into the scene. So I assume that everyone in this room knows this, but this is Clever Hans, if you don't know. And what's so interesting about him is that prior to scientists coming up with the idea that what he was doing, his feats of counting and reading calendars and predicting dates, etc., prior to the hypothesis that learning was what accounted for that, the hypotheses all came around some sort of inherent quality inside the organism, that he had some sort of cognitive abilities inside that were allowing him to perform these feats. But it wasn't. It was a display of learning. He was adapting to his environment, and he was controlling reinforcers with his behavior. He is a glorious example of learning and of behavior change due to experience. At the start, I mentioned that the behavioral level of analysis is my focus, with ethology in the peripheral. Over the history of zoos, ethology has very much been at the forefront. Of our behavior sciences, ethology is king. But I think that behavior analysis needs to be at the forefront. Not to abandon ethology, we have to keep it close. You've seen that all throughout these examples. We're looking to their natural history for information. But we're asking animals to learn how to live in new conditions, in human-made conditions. And behavior analysis is going to be the science that helps us do that. So I think it needs to be at the forefront of our work, because really what we're talking about is learning. And all that flexibility that they have, that's hope for zoos, in my opinion. We are not going to recreate that active surf for every organism in human care. It's beyond attainable. We don't have the resources to create the nature and all of its complexity. But they're showing us that if we get close enough, they're flexible enough to meet us. We have raccoons that are learning to fish in what look like garden boxes. So in nature, they fish in rivers, but in the zoo, they can learn to fish in a garden box instead. This flexibility, I think, is the hope for the future of zoos. So to sum up here, and then I've left a little bit of time for questions. To care for animals well, we're going to need more than their species' natural history. We need it, but alone it's not sufficient. We also have to understand how they learn. Remember that what we mean by learning is behavior change due to experience, and that's part of their nature too. No account of behavior is complete without the environment. And we know that the brain is working. We know that the genes are working, but the environment is working as well. And as caregivers of animals, the environment has a practical value to us because we can change it to change behavior. We have direct access, direct influence to the environment. So it has practical utility that is important. And when we use that, when we engineer environments to free up operant behavior, we're on our way to providing much more enriched lifestyles for the animals in our care. So with that, thank you so much for coming back, staying late, for your attention this evening. And I think we got some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was
Yeah,
fantastic. Super interesting.
Oh, thank
Yeah, lovely to round out the zoo trip with hearing much more information about all the wonderful work that you're doing for the animals.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Yeah, do we have any questions? Many.
Not a question, but you've made horses look really boring.
No, not boring at all.
I was just curious. Yesterday you were talking about the lions and the lambs. How does this all tie into what you guys are doing with the lions in the zoo?
Yeah, so large carnivores present a particularly complicated problem. One of the things that their bodies have evolved to do, that their behavior does for them, is it hunts. It hunts and kills other large animals that are really hard to catch. And of course, we don't have that opportunity available in human care. I can't come up with a way to scale up what we're doing with trout for African lions, where we'd have a prey animal in their environment who has an authentic opportunity to win. I think that it does work scaled up, but I think it's Kruger National Park, where you have prides of lions and you have herds of prey, and it's managed by us, and it works. So I don't know that that's feasible at the scale of the average zoo. So we've just started out on this one, so there's still a lot to be learned. But we set out the same way that we have on all these others, looking to what's the set of circumstances in nature that predicts the behavior patterns that we see. African lions in the wild, in general, will hunt every 2 to 4 days. So there's this long period in between hunts. And I was interested in what accounts for that interval, because we're feeding them every 6 hours. So we must be getting something wrong. If we're visiting them to hand feed meals every 6 hours, and in nature they're eating every 4 days. So back to that, do keepers do everything, or does the land do some of it kind of concept? I was interested in whether or not we could produce that kind of pattern. Could we go visit African lions every 4 days and leave them to their own devices in between? I know that their physiology can do it, but their environment isn't supporting it. So reading through literature of what they do in the wild, we came up with 4 things that we think in the environment that we think accounts for their hunting pattern. Let's see if I can remember all 4 off the top of my head. The first is the difficulty. The task at hand is very hard. So they wait until they're very motivated to perform it, very hungry. They risk their life every time they go hunt. Everything's big in Africa, so they can end up dead just as likely as their prey. So I think the difficulty is one thing that predicts the delay. Another is the intermittent success rate. So again, averages, but they are successful, if I recall correctly, about 40% of their hunts result in success. So they're failing 60% of the time, and it's really hard and dangerous. Another is the intermittent, or maybe I should say the varying availability of prey. They're not always just hanging down at the local water hole. So your opportunities are coming and going as herds are migrating around, or at least your opportunities are varying in how difficult they are. And then the last one is that if you succeed, you produce an enormous amount of food. So if you kill a wildebeest, you have a lot of food to consume. And if you watch lions in Africa, they don't kill the wildebeest and then eat everything in 4 hours and then sleep for 4 days. It takes them 4 days to eat it. And it's interesting, vulture researchers probably have the best handle on that, because they're curious in how long vultures will wait for their chance to eat. And sometimes they're waiting for 6 or 7 days before lions are done with a carcass and vultures get their chance. So we're going to try, and have just started trying, to reproduce those 4 conditions without a live prey animal. So we did one trial of this. We presented whole sheep, dead sheep, and we tried to make them very hard to get. So we suspended them in the habitat with a chain around their spine, thinking that eventually the lions will break the sheep free. But that didn't happen. The sheep were impossible to break free. The behavior that emerged was quite cool. They were hunting. They were stalking, jumping, tearing, charging, working harder than they've probably ever worked in their life. But no one was getting a sheep free, which was okay until our male lion was standing beneath a sheep that was hanging off of a cable 8 feet off the ground. He jumped 8 feet in the air, hugged onto the sheep, pulled the cable out of the concrete wall, and then essentially what we had done is we fed a pride of hungry lions 1 sheep. So then everyone started fighting over the 1 sheep that had fallen. No one could get any of the other sheep. And so it just escalated from there. All lions were okay at the end. So now what I'm looking for, and if anyone in this room has this thing, come find me, because I either need someone to build it or I need to know what it is if it already exists. I would like to have arranged the sheep in the same way, make it so that they're nearly impossible to get, but I'd like control over dropping them. So after some period of time where lions are working that hard, we make the sheep available. But I need to be able to do it with a remote. because I can't. Exactly, yes.
Like 1 in 20, it actually grabs something.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I need. Now I need the remote, and then I think we might be able to get there. So, and then maybe we could take that then to other large carnivores, at least that concept, to try to recreate those conditions. So, lots more to come as we investigate that, but that's where we're at right now, to try and provide them with a meaningful challenge. One that takes them a long time, where reinforcers persist in the environment. Maybe it takes them 4 hours to get that sheep down, and then it takes them 2 days to eat it. That would be my goal. My goal would be that they wouldn't need anything from us for days at a time. I think that it's possible, and it almost worked, but we have now a mechanical problem. We don't really have a behavior problem. It's a mechanical problem. I need an engineer.
Listening to your talk, it made me think about how, because I also kind of do some research at a zoo, how AZA and other zoo organizations like to focus on natural behaviors. And your talk made me think that, what does that mean in context of animals that can adapt to many different environments, where we would say, this is natural for them, and then they adapt to a new environment? Well, that's not really natural anymore, I guess. In a way.
Yeah.
Is maybe the AZA going down the wrong path focusing on this, or is there another definition of this that makes more sense and can kind of adapt?
Yeah, it's an insightful question. What's natural, right? What's natural when the wild muriquis are all living in the grasslands? It just really starts to blur the lines, because what's natural is to change what you do. What's natural is to learn. So I would say that we're focused on a couple of things. One is that the most natural thing is to learn from experience. The most natural environment is one that responds to you. It may not be that it's a tree or grasses, but it's one that responds. When you act, it reacts, and then you're influenced by that. And what's also natural is that operant behavior is free. Those 4 free operant freedoms are there in the natural environment. And then in terms of natural behavior, we are producing a lot of behavior that could fit that label, but we're doing it by identifying natural reinforcers, stimuli, things that matter to that organism, and then we're letting them come up with their own solutions to it. I do have another example that I almost put in here, but I chose to hold it back, so future talk maybe. But with orangutans, where it's less like nature, and it's producing some of the same kind of results, and that presentation that I cited from Hal from the 70s was titled "In Defense of Unnatural Acts by Consenting Animals." And what he was arguing is that it matters that they have control over their environment with their behavior, and that matters even if it looks artificial. And at the time, he had created all sorts of things like games for mandrills to play, where a light would flash, and then whoever pressed the button fastest would get a grape. And you'd have a mandrill playing a game like that for long periods of time. And so he was trying to talk about the value of control, even if it doesn't look like natural behavior. I think that still has a role to play, that if we're looking for them to control their environment with behavior, which is in of itself natural, and then it's free to vary as they learn with whatever species limitations there are. So I don't know if I got at the heart of your question or not, but there's some gray area around it for sure.
Yeah. You did a really good job. I was going to say that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for a lovely talk. In horses, we could easily have 2 types of stereotypical behaviour. One of them is often locomotor, and that is due to a failure to meet their basic needs in the environment. And when we resolve that, the behaviour goes away, as you demonstrated beautifully there. But the other one is a little bit different. With the first type, again, as you said, it often happens before they're expecting something of value. But with the second type, which is often an oral behaviour, you've probably heard of cribbing and weaving in horses, that often occurs after something of value. And we do understand that, dopamine, opioids and such like are involved, particularly the opioids. That's why it becomes so addictive to them. But even when you completely, massively improve that animal's environment, they are still going to have this behaviour. And is that something you see in zoo animals.
Yes, it is. So there's always more to the story, and that's why we need this grand synthesis, as Epstein said. We need all levels of analysis coming together. And now we're moving into maybe a bit more of the physiological level of analysis. So we see it with giraffe. Giraffe will repetitively lick metal in their environment, and they will do it in the absence of meaningful opportunities. So if there's no browse available for long periods of time, they'll go out and they'll do that, similar to a pacing pattern or an elephant swaying. But they will also do it after they eat particular foods. And cattle will do this as well. There's quite a lot of data, even as far back as the 80s, demonstrating that if you feed cattle processed grains and things like that, they will turn to metal in their environment very quickly afterwards and lick it repeatedly for a long period of time. The physiological hypothesis to that is that they're generating a lot of saliva to protect the rumen, which is damaged by that particular food. We think we're seeing something similar with giraffe when we're feeding them processed pellets. For those of you that were at the zoo yesterday, you saw we were training with rye crisp crackers, which we're trying to not do anymore because of the physiological problem. Great for shaping behavior, but a problem for their physiology, we think. So giraffes are the standout example for me, where there's more to the story than the external environment. I do think that the internal environment is part of what accounts for that oral stereotypy that we see giraffe performing, that just the availability of browse is unlikely to see that kind of suppression that we saw with these other responses, unless that's all they were eating, which currently none of us can produce enough browse to manage.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk. I'm going to try to get this question out as best I can, but I've been trying to figure out how to word it, and I haven't landed on a perfect term, so I apologize.
We're ready.
In equitation science, there's a lot of conversations happening these days about trying to give our horses as positive of an environment as we can. But I'm looking at you creating these challenges for these animals, and I'm seeing the video of the cormorant in the waves, and I'm thinking there's got to be an element of frustration there, or the potential for that to emerge. And we're having a lot of conversations, like I said, in equitation science about what right we have as people to impose negative experiences upon our animals, even if, the potential frustration of that challenge can lead to a positive welfare outcome. So I guess I'm wondering what advice you would have for us as equitation scientists about how to balance potential negative impacts for an overall positive outcome under the lens of something that people are doing to captive animals.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's something we discuss in the zoo side as well. It makes me think of a couple examples. One is in a training scenario where I'm directing behavior. There, I'm not looking to make it challenging. I'm looking to make it easy. And in the zoo world, we're primarily training for cooperative care. I'm looking to draw blood and give vaccines and get weights and radiographs and ultrasounds. I want it to be as easy as possible for them to participate in that, and the rate of reinforcement to be very high. So it's a game where you win automatically. And that produces this really enthusiastic engagement in cooperative care training, which is part of what we're trying to produce there. So that's a place where I let all this challenge idea fall by the wayside. And then I've seen examples where, with the line of thinking that some hardship is important, people do things to animals like scare them. So I saw it just at the zoo I was visiting the other day. They had this, over their penguins, this big kite on a bendy pole that would just blow in the wind and slap down around the penguins, and all the penguins would run away. And I think that was that idea, that now there's a challenge of something for you to solve. Something about it's not quite right for me. It's missed the mark. And so I think that in most of these scenarios, they're working to control reinforcers that are meaningful to them, primarily positive reinforcers in most of these scenarios. Not to say that there's not a negative reinforcement element. Like in the example of the cormorant's accessing fish and avoiding waves. There's a lot going on. So it's not fair to identify one contingency necessarily. But I don't think it's about making them uncomfortable. I do think it's about giving them a purpose for their behavior. And if you think about the penguin example, if I take live rainbow trout and I put them in a bathtub, I produce very little behavioral benefit. If my measures are how long does the animal engage, how diverse of a repertoire does it produce, I'm not going to produce much of either of those. They're going to eat all the fish in the bathtub rapidly. It's not going to require much from them. They're not going to cooperate, swim as a group. They're not probably going to develop that breathing pattern. They're just going to go over there and they're going to feast on fish in a barrel. So I think that's where that idea of challenge comes in, is we've provided trout, but trout are in an environment where the trout are faster than you, they have places to hide, and it's going to be really hard for you to succeed. But the trout are very meaningful, so you're willing to work hard in order to control them. And then we're just stepping back and letting them work at that problem. And so far, I haven't seen negative behavioral fallout where, I don't know what it would look like, a penguin that's pulling out its own feathers in presence of trout because it just can't catch one. What we're seeing is animals solving the problem in time. So, those are just some thoughts that come to mind when you ask your question. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more question in the room, I think.
Well, actually, I had a really mundane question, which I'll ask in a second, which is honestly, but from the conversations you guys just had, there was one thing, and this is more from our human psychology, and perhaps it's interesting. It's the whole idea of resilience in human beings. What we see is that essentially human beings who are being challenged, that they develop resilience, which at the end of the line gives them a lot greater mental health, mental strength. And I know it's always dangerous in a group full of animal scientists to talk about, something that might essentially be anthropomorphism, but many of the principles I think that we might be seeing here as well, because you're challenging them to the point that these animals perhaps develop more appropriate coping skills, which is why perhaps we don't see a negative effect.
Yeah, it's an interesting dot connection, and we do talk about the concept of resilience in behavior analysis as the ability for animals to recover from periods where they have less control. And we tend to see it in learners who have a high degree of control much of the time. And it's interesting because while they may not succeed every time they attempt to catch a fish, for example, if we just keep using the penguins, they do have quite a bit of control over that scenario because the operant is free. So they decide when to try, for how long to try, what form they're going to try with. They can take a break and try again 5 minutes later. So they have a high degree of control. And I think that my prediction would be that it does produce more resilient individuals who can recover better from periods where they lose control.
Yeah, because essentially they're also learning different types of coping strategies. What you've just described, that a coping strategy might be going away, recovering, and coming back. But my really mundane question is, those giraffes, the ones that you fed lots and lots and lots of forage, leaves and stuff,
yes,
before they had to sort of engage and sort of eat nitty-bitty bits, were they overweight? Did you see a change in weight?
No, not yet. So we're in the middle of, for those of you that were there yesterday, we're in the middle of massive giraffe-related construction. And when it's finished, it will set the stage for us to feed giraffe in the way that we wish to feed them. So lots of those cylinders throughout the environment. We still want to feed some free browse too, because the debarking behavior we think is of value and they can't do it in the cylinder. But to be able to provide a mix. So what we have right now is really the pilot test, giving us a trajectory and a $50 million construction project behind that idea and some others. That will be done next year. And then we'll really get to start to see what happens if this is their lifestyle all the time. But we haven't seen it yet. And we're constantly wrestling with the how do we get enough browse problem. We have 16 giraffe at the zoo. And so that's a constant daily conversation. What can we do to get more tree material here? What do we do outside the growing season? Jason's very interested in the idea that he could sustain giraffe on 100% browse diet in human care, which most people think is impossible, but he would like to try. So we'll see what he comes up with. I never doubt him. So.
Yeah, I think, we are at time. Do people, I think we have 2 more questions. Are people willing to hang out for 2 more questions?
Yeah, I certainly am.
Okay.
Thank you. And you tell me if this is not relevant, because I know nothing about zoos or zoo development, but thinking about environments and obviously the design of places that are more open, where we as visitors go in and we're caged and the animals are free. What are the pros and cons of that sort of a setup in terms of environment versus what sounds like a more traditional zoo environment?
Maybe the direction I'll go with that, and then you just speak up if it's not related enough, would just be on the idea of the size of the habitat and how important is the size. I think that size is a correlate to their behavioral health, but I don't have any examples where it alone was the variable that mattered. If I double the size of a barren environment, I've just doubled the size of a barren environment. There's still not a reason to behave in it. Now there's more space to do nothing, walk in circles. So I do come across zoo habitats that are enormous, and I watch how animals utilize them, and they're utilizing the corner nearest the keepers. So the size is there, but it's not rich with reinforcers. Cheyenne Mountain Zoo is on the side of a mountain, and so we have a space challenge. So we're really sort of like a stress test for smaller environments, which I think has led to some of these innovations. And what I'd really like to see is bringing all of this to larger enclosures that would likely then deplete even slower. And see, I think maybe the combination of those things is where we ought to be heading. So I think it certainly matters. The bigger the habitat, the slower depletion of resources will be, just because you have to travel. You have to travel to get from one opportunity to the next. That's going to take time. And it also allows us to put more stuff in there. So if our habitats were 10 times larger, we could probably visit them and replenish resources 10 times less often, or something like that. So it's certainly an important correlate, but I think oftentimes when people look at a zoo, the assumption is that if we just made everything bigger, their life would be better. And I think that it's missing the reinforcer component. Size alone may not matter to them. Yeah.
Okay, so we have one last question, which is online. Her question was answered. Oh, her question was answered. Okay. So, all right. So with that, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.